On October 11th, 1887, before sunrise had lifted over the ridge, the thermometer nailed beside the Elkhorn assay office read 24 degrees, and the wind came down the creek corridor hard enough to rattle loose clapboards all along the lower street. Elkhorn, Colorado Territory, held 312 souls that autumn, most tied to the Silver Cut on the north slope, all tied to one another by debt, weather, and rumor. The town sat against a wind-cut bluff above Elkhorn Creek, with privies set too near the bank, boarding houses packed tight, and one public pump serving families, teamsters, and miners, returning black with ore dust. From camps and towns like it, Mercer had learned that sickness never arrived as a private matter. It moved by bucket, by cup, by handrail, by church bench. It moved faster than pride could admit. Russell Mercer came up that road in a freight wagon with 2 trunks, one crate of instruments wrapped in oilcloth, and no formal standing left to protect him. In St. Louis and later in Cheyenne, he had once practiced as a railway surgeon under contracts that gave him authority, assistance, and ordered wards. By the time he reached Elkhorn, he had no board recognition worth naming in polite company, no rail office willing to print his notice, and no expectation of being greeted as anything but a man who had fallen. News traveled west with freight manifests, and from the looks he received at his first stops, his fall had traveled far. He said little when he climbed down from the wagon. He paid the driver, checked the instrument crate for cracked hinges, and carried his trunks through wind that smelled of coal smoke and creek mud. By that evening, in the room he had rented above the cooper's shed, he had already opened his old ledgers and set Elkhorn's name at the top of a fresh page. The fall had begun in January 1881, after a winter derailment east of Cheyenne in wind deep enough to erase tracks as fast as laborers uncovered them. Mercer had triaged the injured by survivability and immediate need, as every field manual required. He treated crushed brakemen first, then firemen and switch crews, then passengers with delayed shock, and only afterward the son of a financier whose influence reached every railboard between Omaha and Denver. The boy died before dawn. Mercer had written the time, pulse decline, and terminal respiration in his chart, with the same hand that had saved 12 others through that night. The newspapers he saw afterward did not print those 12 names. They printed one name and then his. By spring, men who had never stood in a snow-choked cut with 30 wounded and 2 lamps called him reckless. By summer, contracts were withdrawn. By autumn, doors that had once opened at his approach remained closed. For 5 years, he served where credential did not matter, because no one else would come. Freight camps along broken sidings, timber clearings that flooded each thaw, tent settlements laid out too quickly to survive their own waste. He learned through hard arithmetic and sometimes through failure. A fever cluster in Platt Camp taught him that crowding could undo a skilled surgeon more quickly than any knife. A cholera scare near Laramie taught him that one careless latrine trench could erase a month of careful nursing. He read military sanitation manuals by lantern, copied diagrams into a ledger, and tested each recommendation against soil, wind, and labor cost. In those places, nothing remained theory for long. In the Uinta Basin in 1884, he spent 19 days assisting an elder healer from a Ute family known among nearby camps for treating lung and gut sickness during trade seasons. The elder, called Tawa by teamsters who could not pronounce his full name, did not lecture. He set tasks. Mercer carried water and failed, set pits and reset them farther, opened and closed vents until smoke drew cleanly. From that exchange came 3 disciplines Mercer never abandoned. Air must move in one direction through a sick room. Waste must travel farther downhill than any tired man thinks necessary. And stone earth chambers hold a near constant interior climate, close to 55 degrees, when cut deep enough and vented correctly. In winter, such chambers resisted freezing, In summer, they resisted rot. He treated the principle as measurable, not mystical. By the time he reached Elkhorn in early October 1887, his hands had changed shape. Fine surgical steadiness remained, but the skin across his palms carried the thick grain of shovel and pickwork, and the nails held lime that no brush fully removed. He rented a narrow room above a cooper's shed for $3 a month and treated whoever knocked. Split knuckles, mine cough, mule kicks, infected cuts from dull chisels. He charged when men could pay and accepted flour, soap, or kindling when they could not. He listened while they spoke of luck and bad veins and sudden weather turns. He also watched where they drew water, where they dumped waste, how they crowded in cold months, and how swiftly the creek rose when thaw water came down from the higher cuts. The parcel he chose sat west of town under a shale shoulder that most considered worthless, even for grazing, a steep slice of land veined with fractured stone and sparse bunchgrass. It cost him $14, recorded on county paper dated October 19th. The survey line gave him 62 feet of bluff face and a narrow approach road fit for one wagon at a time. Horace Kincaid, proprietor of the general store and acting chair in all but title, called the lot a cold hole fit for foxes when the sale was mentioned near the stove. Men laughed because Kincaid's laugh came first. Mercer made no reply. He only walked the parcel at dusk with a measuring cord, marked the bluff with chalk, and calculated cut angles against runoff. Work began on October the 23rd, 2 hours before daylight. He drove iron wedges into natural seams, split shale blocks in manageable slabs, and carried spoil by handcart down a ramp he built from scrap pine and rail spikes bought secondhand. The first week produced only 10 feet of depth and one collapsed side that had to be shored and reset. He adjusted the cut to follow stronger bedding planes. By the second week, he had a stable entry 20 inches wider with temporary timber braces every 4 feet. By the end of November, he had opened 28 feet of a main gallery at 7 feet clear height, enough for 2 men to pass while carrying a cot between them. He kept each day's progress in a ruled ledger: feet removed, brace count, tool failures, and the cost of replacement handles. Through December, when dawn temperatures dropped to 9 degrees and lamp oil consumed money faster than food, he shifted from excavation to systems. He marked 6 isolation rooms along the gallery wall, each 6 feet by 8 feet, with plank-faced interiors that could be scrubbed with lye. He cut 2 intake shafts of 11-inch diameter to draw air from opposite exposures, one higher for exhaust pull and one lower for fresh inflow, learning their draft behavior by smoke tests at morning, noon, and midnight. He laid stone channels to carry wash water away from bed spaces and roughed a cistern pit above the chambers, positioned for gravity feed. By his own measure, the design did not need elegance. It needed discipline. Money governed every decision. Cedar boards cost $28 per 1,000 board feet delivered, beyond his reach in bulk. So he bought damaged lots and planed usable faces himself. Lime came dear in finished sacks. Therefore, he purchased raw limestone fragments from a quarry team at reduced rate, burned them in a field kiln behind the bluff, slaked in iron troughs, and mixed mortar at a 3-to-1 sand ratio for lining surfaces that needed sealing. Copper kettles for boiling could not yet be afforded, so he repaired dented cast iron pots and marked each with a notch system to enforce rotation: one for heating, one for active boil, one cooling for transport. Even at this early stage, he planned not for one patient, but for many. From the upper path, children stopped to watch sparks from his picks strike in the dark. Teamsters passing at dawn saw smoke from his lime burn and asked whether he was building a root cellar large enough for a regiment. Boarding house women remarked that he purchased soap by crate and coarse cloth by the bolt, then scrubbed planks in creek water even before any bed had been set upon them. Kincaid remarked within easy hearing at the store counter, that a man could bury himself in labor and still emerge wrong. Mercer heard the line repeated often enough to know it had spread. Mercer answered once, and only once, to a mine carpenter who asked why he persisted when laughter followed every wagon load of stone. "Walls do not argue with weather or sickness," he said while setting a brace pin with 3 hard blows. "They either hold or they fail." Then he returned to work. By the first week of January 1888, snow packed hard along the Bluff Road, and the main gallery measured 48 feet from entry to back wall. 4 isolation rooms stood framed. 2 remained marked in chalk. The cistern lining had cured enough to hold test water without seep at the lower seam, and the intake shafts drew steadily when wind moved from the northwest. From what he heard in town, Elkhorn still regarded the project as an eccentric trench carved by a disgraced surgeon who had mistaken fear for wisdom. Yet the structure was taking shape in stone, timber, lime, and exact numbers, and numbers did not bend for opinion. On January 9th, 1888, with the dawn temperature at 6 degrees and a dry wind combing spindrift off the bluff face, Mercer stood in the gallery mouth and watched his breath move toward the upper shaft in a thin white stream, then vanish into the dark pull he had cut for that exact purpose. He burned one twist of newspaper at floor height, then another at shoulder height, timing the draw with a pocket watch whose crystal was cracked along one edge. The lower air moved in, the warmer air moved out, and the chamber held at 54 degrees while the street above froze hard enough to split a water pail seam. The town still called the place a grave. The walls kept answering in numbers. By the 3rd week of January, he had set the 5th and 6th room frames and planed their plank faces smooth enough that lye water would not collect in splinters. He drove each nail flush, then countersank the heads and sealed the dimples with lime wash so no rust would leach into scrub water. His ledger entries became more exact as his means grew tighter. 12 pounds of cut nails at 9 cents per pound, 1 barrel of lye soap at $1.40, 2 second-hand door hinges straightened in a vise and reused, 1 splitting maul handle replaced after grain failure in the cold. He wrote every figure with disciplined script and left no blank lines, because blank lines invited false memory. At night, above the cooper shed, Mercer copied older notes into cleaner columns so that one hard season would not erase what another had taught him. He drew a map of the 1881 derailment cut with lampblack and red pencil, marking where men had lain when the snow buried the rail ties. And beside that map, he wrote the lesson that had cost him his name in the cities. Triage was arithmetic under pressure, and arithmetic did not bend to influence. On another page, he copied sanitation rules from military field manuals, then crossed out 3 instructions that failed in high wind country, and wrote replacements learned in camps that had no surgeon and no patience for theory. Tawa's methods appeared in those pages without ornament. Mercer wrote, "Air must be taught where to go. Waste must be made to travel farther than comfort allows. Stone stores steadiness when timber and cloth cannot." He listed the practice drills exactly as they had been given. Smoke test at morning chill, midday stillness, evening crosswind, latrine trench depth 3 feet minimum in loose soil, 4 in mixed clay. Drainage run pitched 1 inch per 6 feet, so standing fouled water could not linger near sleeping ground. When he had first met the elder in 1884, he had arrived with surgical certainty and left with a laborer's humility. In Elkhorn, he kept both, and neither won him favor. By February 2nd, snowmelt refroze each night in ridged plates along Lower Street, and traffic to the store thickened because Kincaid had received a delayed freight wagon with flour, lamp oil, and coffee sacks. He stood broad and prosperous behind the counter in a wool coat lined with beaver, rings bright against his ledger, a man whose confidence had never yet been made to share a room with consequence. He could laugh and raise credit in the same motion. When miners asked whether Mercer's tunnels were fit for saints or sinners, Kincaid answered that both might fit, provided the doctor dug deep enough. Men carried that line to the assay office, to the boarding tables, and finally up to the Bluff itself. Mercer's response remained practical. He sought materials where contempt had less reach. He bought warped cedar coal boards from a sawyer 5 miles down creek at $11 per 1,000 board feet if he hauled them himself, lashed loads to a hired mule sledge, and accepted that each trip consumed nearly a day. He traded treatment of a crushed thumb to the blacksmith for 8 pounds of scrap strap iron, then cut the iron into corner braces for cots that could be disassembled and scalded. He purchased 2 damaged copper kettles from a hotel kitchen in Granite Falls for $6 both, hammered their rims true on a stump anvil, and tested each for boil retention with creek water and a sand timer. In late February, the church relief committee met to discuss spring indigent stores and did not send him notice, though he had treated 3 committee families through winter cough and 1 child's scarlet rash without fee. The omission was not accidental. It was governance by exclusion, done politely and in full daylight. Mercer learned of it from the cooper's wife and only asked whether they had mapped Privy Drift from thaw lines. She answered that no such map had been discussed. He thanked her and returned to the Bluff before dusk, where he set chalk marks on the gallery floor for triage lanes that no one had requested and no one yet believed necessary. 3 days later, he began the cistern cap, laying lime mortar in weather just warm enough to avoid freeze fracture, then covering the work with canvas and coal braziers through the night so cure would continue. The cap measured 10 feet by 8, with a hatch and screened intake to keep debris and flies from standing water. He set a gravity line from cistern to wash station using salvaged pipe in 12-foot sections, sealing each joint with hemp and lead paste. At full test, the line filled 2 kettles and 1 scrub trough in 11 minutes. He timed this also. In outbreak conditions, minutes had weight. By March 15th, wind shifted and held from the south for 4 days, bringing thaw scent and soft ground along the creek margins. Mercer walked the bank before sunrise with a probing rod and marked 4 lower privy pits that had slumped toward runoff channels. He paid 2 boys 20 cents each to carry dyed water barrels from those points to the creek bend, then stood with watch in hand at the public pump while townsfolk queued for buckets. 8 hours and 46 minutes after release, faint carmine traced the pump outflow. He repeated the test twice under different flow rates. Results varied by less than 20 minutes. Contamination did not need rumor. It had a travel time. He requested formal hearing at the next council meeting and attached an itemized requisition. Cedar cot stock for 20 beds, $74. 2 additional copper kettles, $18. Soap and lye bulk, $27. Quarantine rope, chalk, and canvas screens, $19. Labor stipend for sanitation crews, 6 weeks, $92. Total, $230. At the bottom, he wrote his condition in plain language. No salary drawn by Mercer until first frost, if protocol adopted in full. He sent 1 copy to council, 1 to church committee, 1 to Kincaid as acting chair of supply coordination, and filed the 4th in his ledger under public measures, April 1888. On April 27th, thaw water ran brown and quick, and the morning thermometer reached 63 degrees by 10 o'clock, warm enough to bring flies to the pump seam in visible knots. The council gathered on the church steps after service because the meeting room could not hold the crowd. Teamsters, miners, wives with market baskets, and boys in shirt sleeves stood shoulder to shoulder while Mercer presented his map and dyed test timings. He spoke without ornament, shared water, crowded interiors, and summer heat would combine. Fever would not ask permission. Procedure had to begin before the first cluster. Kincaid stepped forward before any vote could form. He held Mercer's requisition in one gloved hand, as if it were a bill of sale for panic. His voice carried with the ease of a man long practiced at being agreed with. He said Elkhorn needed steadiness, not imported alarm from a surgeon who had already failed where stakes were larger than this town would ever see. He said he would not let trade be strangled by quarantine fantasies. Then, looking from the church rail to the bluff cut above town, he gave the name that would travel faster than any map: Mercer's Tomb. Laughter came in waves, uneven at first, then joined. No vote was recorded. The council dispersed into knots of talk and dismissal. By evening, Kincaid had quietly raised lamp oil again, from 18 cents to 31 cents per gallon, and suppliers who depended on store credit discovered reasons to postpone Mercer's orders. One sawyer claimed wagon trouble. Another found his lumber suddenly promised elsewhere. Scarcity was being administered, not suffered. Mercer marked each failed purchase attempt in the ledger with date, hour, and stated reason, then drew a line beneath the page and wrote, "Continue by substitution." He did exactly that. He cut additional shelving from mine crating, scrubbed it with boiling lye, and set it high off the floor where runoff could not reach. He split old wagon tongues into stretcher poles, wrapped hand grips in boiled cloth, and fitted removable slings stitched from flour sack canvas. He built a second exterior lane with shale retaining walls, so suspected cases could be brought in without crossing supply traffic. At dusk, he whitewashed directional arrows on stone. Intake, wash, isolate, burn. Each word was simple enough to be followed in fear. On the first Monday of May, while he was drilling drain weep holes at the lane edge, a small bundle appeared on the gallery threshold. A packet of square nails, 2 folded lengths of clean linen, and a note in careful hand that read, "For rooms, not for graves." No signature sat beneath it, but the linen edge carried the blacksmith shop's blue thread mark used on Pike family aprons. Mercer set the bundle on the supply shelf, entered the donation as anonymous in his ledger, and returned to the drill. Above him, the town continued with dances, shifts, sermons, and market days, convinced that confidence could serve as policy. Inside the bluff, the system moved one measured step closer to readiness. The next morning, he carried the folded linen to the wash table, boiled it for 20 minutes in lye water, rinsed it twice in the upper cistern line, and laid it across a rope where clean air from the lower shaft could dry it without smoke taint. He treated the gift as he treated all supplies in the infirmary, not as sentiment, but as inventory with a purpose. Then he chalked a new sequence on the gallery wall, larger than before and visible by lantern at 30 feet. Intake first, wash second, assign third, isolate fourth, record always. He had learned that fear erased memory in orderly men. Procedure had to outlast fear. By the second week of May, the Bluff chambers no longer resembled a private obsession cut into stone, but a functioning system with redundancies, clean pathways, and measurable capacity. Mercer finished 20 cots in 6 days, each frame built from reinforced cedar culls, each sling sewn from doubled flour canvas, each cot spaced 4 feet from the next so attendants could pass without brushing bedding. He drove a line of pegs at shoulder height and hung numbered slates over each room entrance, then copied those numbers into a roster ledger with columns for arrival hour, temperature, stool frequency, water tolerance, and contact households. In camps where fever had outrun record-keeping, he had seen whole families disappear into rumor because no one wrote down who came in first. In Elkhorn, he refused that disorder. He extended the upper retaining wall 12 more feet to protect the supply lane from runoff, packed the wall core with shale chips and clay, and capped it with lime-set stone that shed water toward a drainage trench pitched 1 inch for every 6 feet of run. Where timber touched earth, he painted a thick lye-lime slurry to resist rot and insect nesting. At the wash station, he mounted 2 salvaged pump handles to separate clean draw from foul discard, painted one handle white and one black, and posted a rule board in plain script: white hand for clean draw only, black hand for waste only. Do not cross them. He placed a bell by the entry and set a coded ring pattern for arrivals after dark: 1 short for supply, 2 long for suspected fever, continuous for collapse in transit. Money remained his narrowest corridor. Lamp oil at 31 cents per gallon forced him into shorter evening shifts, so he polished reflector plates from discarded tin to double lantern throw. He rendered tallow from butcher scrap to make emergency candles that smoked but held a steady flame when glass chimneys cracked. He purchased bulk coarse salt at $1 per sack for oral rehydration broth, then tested ratios in marked cups, settling on 1 level spoon per quart with molasses when available, and plain when not. For fuel, he contracted 2 cordwood teams at reduced rate if he accepted mixed cut lengths and split the oversized rounds himself. His ledger calculation held 9 cords per month for continuous boil rotations every 3 hours if case count exceeded 30. 3 days later, he opened the decontamination pit, not deep but broad, lined with stone and iron grat bars set on a slight incline. There he could burn contaminated straw, rag waste, and sweepings without carrying foul bundles through the main lane. He built a second pit farther downslope for ash burial and marked both with stakes painted red at the tips. In one corner of the gallery, he assembled a compact pharmacy: willow bark, charcoal powder, diluted carbolic, vinegar washes, camphor for chest relief, and opiate tincture under lock for severe pain only. Every bottle received a wax-sealed label with dosage lines heavy enough to read in weak light. He did not trust memory where error could kill. By late May, organized resistance hardened from laughter into policy. Kincaid did not denounce Mercer every day, because men with power seldom needed to repeat themselves that often. But he adjusted credit lines with careful timing so that any supplier who sold to the Bluff Infirmary risked a sudden call on overdue balances. A carter who had promised gravel for lane stabilization arrived at dawn, hat in hand, and admitted he could not deliver unless paid cash in full before loading. A tinsmith who had accepted order for covered slop pails returned Mercer's deposit through a boy and attached a note that trade conditions required delay without date. At the store counter, Kincaid's rings tapped the ledger while he announced new terms for soap and canvas to discourage speculative hoarding. Men understood who those terms targeted. Social punishment widened with equal discipline. The Church Relief Committee posted summer work rosters and left Mercer's name off nursing lists, despite his request to train volunteers in basic sanitation. Boarding house owners who had once sent for him at midnight began summoning him only when fever was already advanced, then complained he arrived grave and unsmiling. At the Sunday market, 2 women moved their basket table 10 feet when he approached, one muttering that disease followed men who expected it. Boys on the creek path took up Kincaid's phrase in chorus, calling the Bluff chambers Mercer's tomb, then adding tomb doctor whenever he hauled water uphill. The insult became routine, and routine gave cruelty its permanence. Mercer answered with work and with records that could not be shouted down. He began evening drills with 3 volunteers who would still come when mocked. A widowed laundress named Cora Latimer, an aging mule skinner called Ben Yarrow, whose hearing was poor but whose hands were steady, and Lena Pike, 15 years old and taller than many grown women, her braid tied with blacksmith thread. Lena did not ask for praise and did not hide her face. She carried nail kegs, scrubbed cot slings, and copied intake forms in a disciplined hand, while her father kept his forge open below town. When Mercer demonstrated how to move a weakened patient without folding the lungs, she repeated the lift until the motion became exact. When he explained why waste pits had to sit 210 feet downhill from any drinking point, she paced the distance herself and set marker stakes to prove it. Souls watching from the lane called her foolish for assisting him. She did not answer them. One evening in early June, Horace Kincaid climbed the Bluff approach with 2 councilmen and stopped at the gate rope without stepping inside. Prosperity still sat easily on him then. Broad wool coat despite warming days, polished boots hardly marked by dust, beard trimmed square, silver watch chain bright against his vest. He surveyed the lanes, the scrub racks, the lime-washed signage, and the stacked cordwood under canvas, then spoke in the measured tone of a merchant issuing terms. "You are creating panic architecture," he said. "When men see cots and burn pits, they imagine plague where there is only summer ague. Trade depends upon confidence. You are poisoning confidence for your own vindication." Mercer stood with a bucket in one hand, lye stinging the raw skin across his knuckles. "Confidence does not sterilize a cup," he said. "Procedure does." Kincaid's mouth tightened but did not rise. "If sickness comes, homes will nurse their own. We are not a camp of drifters to be sorted in chalk lines." Mercer placed the bucket by the wash trough and looked past Kincaid to the creek bend, where evening shadows already covered the lower privies. "If sickness comes in numbers, homes will fail by arithmetic. I am building for numbers." Kincaid left without reply. By nightfall, word spread that Mercer had compared Elkhorn families to freight camp refuse. He had said no such thing. The version with insult traveled farther. 3 weeks passed, and the mockery reached into institutions that were meant to hold the town together. The school board declined his offer to inspect classroom water pails, citing concern that medical talk would frighten children. The church sexton refused use of the meeting hall for sanitation instruction because alarmist doctrine would divide the congregation. At the assay office, a clerk copied a crude sketch of the Bluff gallery on scrap paper and pinned it beside the rates board under the caption "Reservations Open" at Mercer's tomb. Men laughed before shift and again after supper. Laughter cost nothing and allowed each listener to avoid deciding whether he might be wrong. By the first week of July, false ease settled over Elkhorn with such gentleness that caution itself began to look unreasonable. The days ran warm, but not punishing, mostly between 78 and 84 degrees. Nights cooled enough for porch talk, and wedding fiddles carried across the upper street on 2 successive Saturdays. Miners washed and dressed in pressed shirts. Church attendance swelled. Kincaid extended credit for ribbon and imported tea, and the store windows looked prosperous enough to reassure any doubter that order had prevailed. The town chose optimism as if it were a municipal ordinance. Mercer kept measuring. On July 3rd, at 6 in the morning, he found flies clustered in dark knots around the pump seam where water pooled in a shallow crack. On July 5th, he logged 3 households from separate streets reporting the same pattern after market day. Abrupt abdominal cramping, fever by evening, weakness severe enough to miss shift by dawn. On July 7th, he ran another dye test from a slumped privy trench above the creek and clocked contamination reach at 8 hours and 58 minutes to the public drawline. Results matched spring drift within margin. Heat had changed little except consequence. He carried the figures first to the council clerk, who accepted the paper and set it beneath tax receipts. He carried them next to Reverend Nathaniel Crow, who listened with folded hands and answered that fear could become its own contagion if announced from the pulpit without certainty. Mercer replied that certainty in epidemic work was measured in trends, not in single dramatic deaths. Crow asked him to pray for moderation. Mercer thanked him and left the church steps with the unposted warning still in his satchel. On July 10th, he posted his own notice at the Bluff Lane and at the blacksmith wall with permission from Amos Pike. Boil all drinking water not less than 10 minutes. Separate ill from well immediately. Report shared water fevers within 1 hour. Use the upper lane only for suspected cases. Kincaid ordered his clerks to remove the notice from the store door before midday, stating private postings could not obstruct trade messaging. Lena copied the notice by hand that evening and slipped it under 6 doors on Lower Street. By July 14th, temperature at noon reached 91 degrees, and air in the boarding corridors turned stale before supper. Mercer began pre-assigning family roles anyway, house by house where he was allowed entry. 1 hauler, 1 boil attendant, 1 latrine watch, 1 runner for supplies. Some accepted his worksheets in silence. Others set them aside unopened. Cora Latimer gathered women willing to wash bedding in segregated lots and marked each bundle with charcoal initials, so clean cloth did not return to contaminated rooms. Ben Yarrow built a handcart rack for covered wasp pails and tested wheel tracks through the lower lane after rain. Lena mapped water points on butcher paper and drew circles where runoff from privies crossed foot traffic. The break came on July 19th, during the second school hour, when Edwin Hale collapsed beside his desk and struck the floor hard enough to overturn the attendance slate. He was carried home with fever so high, his skin burned through wet cloth within minutes. Mercer arrived, established immediate isolation, and ordered boil lines for the household and nearest 2 neighbors sharing water vessels. Some complied, others waited to see. Within 48 hours, 2 of Hale's pupils took sick in separate homes on opposite ends of town. Their families had not visited one another. Both had drawn from the public pump after market day. Mercer marked the cases, set red chalk on the map, and moved from private preparation to emergency command without waiting for permission. He stretched rope lanes at the infirmary gate, lit the decontamination pit before dusk, and opened the first intake ledger to page 1. The question in Elkhorn was no longer whether his warnings had merit. The question had become how many lives procedure could still reach before pride exhausted its final argument. Within 2 hours of opening the intake ledger, Mercer had 12 names on the first page and 3 more waiting under the shale overhang, while Cora Latimer boiled cloth strips in the black-marked kettle, and Ben Yarrow kept the waste cart moving downslope in measured circuits. The date was July 19th, 1888. By 3 in the afternoon, the thermometer at the assay office reached 93 degrees in the shade, and inside the lower boarding corridors, the heat held like a closed hand. Mercer sent Lena Pike with chalk and rope to mark household thresholds where shared cups had already crossed from sick to well, then ordered every water pail in those houses boiled and relabeled before sunset. He no longer sought permission. He issued sequence. Night offered no relief. Air stalled over Elkhorn Creek and refused to turn, and the smell from slumped privies on the south bank settled into the lower street so thickly that wagon teams shied at it. Families who had mocked his lane rules in June now arrived in pairs with blankets, asking where to stand, what to carry, what to burn, and where to place their own hands when fear made them careless. Mercer answered each question with the same economy he used in surgery. 1 instruction, then the next, then the next. No wasted language and no allowance for debate. White hand pump for clean draw. Black hand pump for foul discard. Bedding to the burn pit if soiled. Pots at full boil for 10 minutes, timed by sandglass, not by guest. By July 21st, case counts doubled again. The church committee opened the meeting hall as an overflow ward before dawn, then lost control of entry by midday when 3 households arrived together and spread pallets between the pew rows. Boarding houses attempted home nursing and failed by arithmetic, exactly as Mercer had warned. One attendant for six sick souls became one, exhausted attendant for 10, then no attendant fit to stand. Families who had relied on confidence as policy discovered that confidence did not lower fever, clean a cup, or keep waste away from water lines. The town had built for wages and appearances. It had not built for contagion. Horace Kincaid still resisted full quarantine for 2 more days, and those days cost Elkhorn dearly. At his store, he kept both doors open to preserve trade flow, though the men entering at dawn carried the same rope marks on their sleeves that Mercer used for suspect households. He sold patent tonics at inflated prices and called them preventive. He raised vinegar to 42 cents per bottle and soap to 27 cents per bar. Then claimed freight delays forced his hand. Men paid because they had wives and parents burning under quilts at home, and no other system to trust yet. By evening, his counters were crowded with coin, and his ledger columns swelled, but his authority thinned in proportion. Prosperity looked less like command and more like delay, purchased at the expense of strangers. 3 days passed before the first institutional failure became undeniable, even to those who had defended him. The public pump, never rebuilt, began drawing cloudy after a night storm drove runoff through the lower trench. Mercer nailed a quarantine board across the handle at sunrise on July 24th, and Kincaid sent a clerk to pull it down. Lena replaced it within the hour with iron wire and a bolt. By noon, 2 teamsters argued in the street over whether to trust the warning, and one collapsed mid-argument before either man finished his claim. After that, no one removed the board again. The heat intensified in the first week of August. On August 2nd, the assay thermometer registered 96 degrees at 4 in the afternoon, with night air holding near 79 and no wind moving through the creek cut. Flies gathered at every damp seam. Door handles turned slick under constant use. The church bell, once rung for service and weddings, rang for sanitation shifts and burial notice. Mercer expanded intake beyond the original 6 rooms, placing cots in the main gallery with 4-foot spacing as planned, then adding a canvas partition to maintain one-way air movement from clean lane to isolation wall. The infirmary held because it had been built to hold. Outside those walls, structures of habit failed in sequence. Boarding house kitchens ran out of clean vessels before dawn and began reusing cups without full boil. Mine bunk rooms lost half their crews to fever and closed shafts early, which cut wages and sent hungry men toward the store counters in search of food they could not safely prepare. The church women who had once excluded Mercer from relief lists now came to the Bluff for instruction in washing protocol. Sleeves rolled high, faces gray with fatigue but hands willing. Kincaid's shelves, full in July, emptied by category rather than by need. First soap, then vinegar, then coarse flour, then lamp oil, leaving bolts of ribbon and imported tins no one could use against thirst and heat. Merchandise became decoration. Edwin Hale died at dawn on August 4th in the 2nd isolation room, after 5 days of relentless decline and 2 brief rallies that had encouraged his neighbors too early. He asked Cora Latimer, in a voice already narrow from effort, to return his attendance ledger to the schoolhouse and tell his pupils they had not been dismissed, only postponed. Mercer recorded the hour, the temperature, and the contact households on line 31 of the intake page, then closed Hale's slate and washed the bed frame himself before the next admission came through intake. There was no ceremony in the gallery. There was only continuity of care. By August 5th, fatigue had become its own hazard. Men carrying water stumbled on the lane stones. Women at the Boyle station burned wrists and did not notice until Cora caught the smell of singed cloth. Ben Yarrow, who had not missed a shift in 12 days, sat down beside the waste cart at noon and could not hear Lena calling his name, until Mercer knelt and touched his shoulder. Mercer reassigned him to ledger transfer work inside the cool chamber, put a younger hauler on the cart route, and kept the cycle turning. Ruth Pike died that same evening, and her death settled over Elkhorn with a moral weight no argument could evade. She had spent 2 days carrying clean canteens from the upper cistern line to households under watch, refusing rest while her husband Amos worked forge repairs for stretcher braces. At dusk, outside a boarding house that had shut its door to prevent further crowding, she handed her final full canteen to her youngest son and told him to take it straight to the marked White Hand station and wait for Lena there. He obeyed. Ruth took 3 steps toward the lane rope, steadied herself against the post, and sank to the ground before anyone could bring a cot. Mercer reached her within minutes, but the fever had already taken too much. He marked her line in the ledger with the same disciplined hand, and then sent Lena home under escort for 1 hour of rest, because grief and exhaustion together could destroy a capable worker faster than sickness alone. No one in town mocked the phrase Mercer's tomb after Ruth Pike's burial. The name remained, but its meaning had broken. Thomas Bell died on August 7th, 2 days after refusing quarantine assignment and attempting to drive a freight wagon south before dawn. He had argued that open road air would cure him, that confinement meant surrender, that he had outrun bad luck before and would do it again. Mercer had warned him plainly at the lane gate that fever carried by one determined man could seed 3 camps in a week. Bell cursed the rope line, turned his team anyway, and vanished in morning dust. His wagon was found by riders near Dry Fork, horses still harnessed and standing patient in their traces beside the road. Bell slumped against the wheel in heat that had not eased since noon. The riders brought him back wrapped in canvas. Even those who had agreed with him fell silent when the team was led through town. After Bell's return, requests for entry came in a steady stream that no household prestige could alter. Families who had once refused Mercer's worksheets now asked for duplicate copies. Church elders reported directly to Lena for wash assignments. The council clerk delivered blank ledgers and asked where to place tables. Mercer did not pause to measure the change in tone. He assigned work by capacity, not by social rank, and posted schedules by lantern light, hauling shifts at first bell and dusk, boil rotations every 3 hours, latrine checks at sunrise and midnight, burial crews separate from food lines. On August 8th, with heat still severe and the case ledger at 61 suspected infections, Horace Kincaid climbed the Bluff lane without coat, without gloves, without the polished composure that had once made disagreement feel like impudence. Dust coated his boots to the ankle. His beard had gone uneven, as if cut in haste with unsteady hands. Under one arm he carried his account books bound in leather. In the other he supported his grown daughter, May Kincaid, who kept his store ledgers and now burned with fever high enough that she could not keep her eyes open in the sun. He stopped at the rope line and didn't look toward the crowd gathering below. "I have delayed too long," he said, each word forced through breath that shook. "Set her where she can be treated. Take these keys. Take the books. Ration my stock as you judge fit. I will stand where you tell me and do what work is assigned." Mercer did not answer with accusation. He signaled Lena to open intake, directed Cora to room 4 where airflow ran strongest, and moved May to cot placement with clean draw already waiting. Then he took the store keys, handed them at once to Ben Yarrow for transfer to the supply table, and told Kincaid to wash to the elbows at the Black Hand station, change shirt, and report to the boil line within 10 minutes. Kincaid obeyed without argument. By sunset, his clerks were unloading soap, flour, lamp oil, and salt under Lena's tally marks instead of his price board. Mercer posted ration quantities at the lane entrance and struck out all private credit claims until outbreak end, replacing them with household counts and care priority. No one cheered. No one spoke of victory. They worked under heat and ash and the constant ringing of the bell, while inside the Bluff chambers the air kept moving one direction. The kettles kept cycling every 3 hours, and the system Elkhorn had laughed at became the only system left that functioned. Through that night, the Bluff worked like a machine built from stone, heat, and obedience. Kincaid stood at the boil line beside men who had once waited on his prices, feeding split cordwood under the kettles while Lena called times from a sandglass, and Cora checked each vessel for full rolling boil before release to the clean lane. Mercer moved from room to room with the intake ledger tucked beneath his arm, pausing at every cot long enough to measure pulse, tongue moisture, stool loss, and response to broth, then marking each line with hour and initials so no shift could pretend to remember what had not been written. By August 10th, the assay thermometer still read 94 degrees in late afternoon, yet the first measurable turn appeared inside the infirmary walls. New admissions did not stop, but the ratio changed. For every 5 severe arrivals, 2 now stabilized through night rather than collapsing before dawn. That margin came from practices men had mocked as theatrical in spring. Cedar cots that could be scrubbed and dried quickly prevented bedding rot. 4-foot spacing cut cross-contact at the narrowest passages. Intake and exhaust shafts held airflow one direction, from clean threshold toward isolation wall, even when outside air lay stagnant over the creek cut. Kincaid's imported patent bottles, purchased at high freight cost and sold for panic coin, sat unopened in a crate near the supply table because none of them could replace boiled water, separated waste, and timed care. 3 days passed before Mercer permitted himself one procedural risk. He shifted May Kincaid from strict isolation room 4 to the monitored gallery row, where recovering patients could be watched by one attendant rather than 2. Her fever had broken in steps, not in miracle fashion, first from 104 to 102 by midnight, then to 100 after dawn broth, then rising again before finally settling below danger by the evening of August 12th. Kincaid asked twice whether he could stand beside her cot. Mercer allowed one visit under wash protocol, 5 minutes timed by Lena's watch, and no touch beyond the blanket edge. Kincaid complied exactly, then returned to kettle duty without requesting privilege a second time. On August 14th, with heat finally easing to 88 degrees and wind returning from the northwest, Mercer ordered the first full sanitation review beyond the Bluff lanes. He sent crews house by house with mapped instructions pinned to each team board. Privy pits to be cut deeper and moved downslope where soil allowed, wash barrels to be kept covered, shared ladles to be replaced with household marked tins, and all draw water boiled for 10 minutes until further notice. Reverend Crow carried one board himself through the church district, boots thick with mud and lime. Amos Pike rebuilt 2 pump collars to Mercer's dimensions, adding stone skirts and drainage channels so runoff could not pool at the seam. Men who had laughed in June now measured trench pitch with string and stakes, arguing over inches because they had seen what one careless inch could cost. The outbreak bent, then broke by discipline rather than relief. On September 17th, after 41 days of full quarantine rotation, Elkhorn recorded 67 severe cases, 41 recoveries treated in the Bluff Infirmary, and no fresh infection linked to the rebuilt upper pump for 7 consecutive days. The bell rang once at noon, not for burial duty but for public notice that emergency isolation would stand down at sunset while boil orders remained in force through first hard frost. Mercer closed the active ledger, tied it with waxed cord, and placed it on the shelf above his 1881 field notes. Then he washed the room slates and left them blank for the first time since July 19th. The harvest meeting was called for September 22nd in the churchyard because the hall could not hold the town and the Infirmary lane still required clear access. 289 souls attended by the clerk's count, hats in hand, sleeves patched, faces lined by heat and sleepless weeks. Kincaid stood first, no rings on his fingers, coat plain, account book under one arm as if he had carried it there for judgment. He spoke longer than anyone had heard him speak without bargaining. "I called this place Mercer's Tomb," he said, voice rough with use rather than performance. "I said panic would ruin trade, and I sold delay as prudence while disease moved through shared water. I did not test in rooms I did not inspect. I priced soap and vinegar as if scarcity were weather, not my choice. Edwin Hale is dead. Ruth Pike is dead. Thomas Bell is dead. Their names remain while my excuses do not. My daughter breathes because the man I mocked kept to his measures when I kept to my pride. I ask what forgiveness can mean when the dead remain dead, and I place my ledgers under town audit until this council decides what restitution trade can make to the households that paid panic prices." No one answered immediately. Wind moved through the cottonwoods by the creek and lifted dust at boot height. Then Reverend Crow stepped forward and spoke without pulpit cadence, plain and unadorned. I asked for moderation when warning was required. I guarded calm because I feared division, and in that choice I allowed danger to keep its pace. I excluded instruction from this yard in June. In August, I carried sanitation boards through homes where children asked why we had waited. I have no defense fit for this hour. After him came Alma Voss of the lower boarding house, who admitted she had turned away Ruth Pike at her door before reopening too late under Mercer's Lane rules. Then Elias Trent, council clerk, who confessed he had filed Mercer's April requisition beneath tax receipts and told himself procedure could wait one more week. Each statement differed in detail but shared the same underlying structure. A word spoken in confidence, a delay chosen for comfort, a cost paid by another household. Shame in Elkhorn that day was not spectacle, but inventory. Mercer stood beside the gate rope through all of it, hat brim low, hands lime-marked from morning repairs. He did not interrupt. He did not bless the speeches. He waited until the line of speakers ended, and the silence that followed became heavier than any accusation. "Forgiveness is not a sentence said in public," he answered at last. "It is a discipline held when memory grows convenient. If you seek absolution, begin where error began. In practice, the ledger is open to any household that will study it. Every line in it was paid for. Some lines were paid with lives. Do not honor the dead by praising me. Honor them by refusing to repeat the conditions that took them." He turned toward Kincaid before continuing. "Your restitution question has arithmetic, return price difference on soap, vinegar, and water casks sold during quarantine days, household by household, with clerk witness. Fund cedar stock for 10 additional cots and 2 travel kits for camp outbreaks. Publish costs at the store door weekly through winter. If you do this faithfully, the town may decide what name to give your conduct." Then he addressed the full yard again. "I will not take office. I will not draw salary beyond replacement of consumed supplies. What I will do is teach. Lena Pike, Cora Latimer, Ben Yarrow, and any 2 former mockers they select will begin apprentice rounds at First Light Monday. We will cover quarantine math, water mapping, lane design, and thermal mass construction. Those who complete the drills will be sent to nearby camps when called. This is the only useful answer I have." No cheer followed. Men and women nodded once, as at terms in a binding contract, and the meeting broke into working groups before dusk. Kincaid and Clerk Trent sat at a pine table in front of the store with account books open and a cash box between them. calculating overcharges down to the cent and writing receipts that carried both signatures. Reverend Crow posted weekly sanitation instruction after Sunday service and kept it posted when attendance thinned. Alma Voss paid Amos Pike to rebuild boarding house privies to slope standard and hired 2 wash attendants year-round rather than only in winter. By the second week of October, apprentice rounds had become routine in Elkhorn. Lena led measurement walks with a surveyor's calm, pacing 210 feet downhill before marking any waste point. Cora taught cloth segregation and boil cadence, insisting that clean and foul pathways never cross even when labor ran short. Ben trained haulers on cart balance and wheel cleaning, so slop did not stripe through food lanes. 2 men who had once shouted Tomb Doctor on the creek path, Jasper Noon and Caleb Rusk, now carried the travel kits to a logging camp above Timber Creek and returned with signed notes confirming they had established separate draw stations before first snow. Winter came early that year. First hard freeze on November the 3rd with dawn at 12 degrees, but Elkhorn entered it with systems rather than guesswork. The upper pump held clear under its new stone skirt. Store ledgers carried restitution columns through January and closed with no unpaid claims. The Bluff Infirmary remained active at reduced occupancy, not as a place of dread, but as a standing institution maintained by roster. On January 1, 1889, the council recorded a revised town code requiring latrine setbacks, mandatory boil orders during runoff events, and emergency authority vested in the infirmary superintendent during declared outbreaks. They offered the superintendent post to Mercer. He declined and recommended a rotating board led by trained apprentices. Years later, the bluff above Elkhorn Creek still stands cut in measured lines, its gallery cool in July heat and steady through January cold. Its beams smoke dark from thousands of kettle hours, its lane stones worn smooth by boots that came first in fear and later in duty. Children now learn the white hand and black hand rule before they learn assay weights. Storekeepers post sanitation bulletins beside flour prices as a matter of ordinary trade. In spring runoff, crews test die travel times as routinely as they check bridge bolts. What had been mocked as panic architecture became municipal habit. Lena Pike eventually takes charge of regional training, riding circuit to camps from Quartz Hill to Cedar Bluff, with 2 apprentices at a time and a copy of Mercer's ledger wrapped in oilcloth behind the saddle. She adds pages, dates, temperatures, costs, and failures included, because she was taught that omissions invite myth, and myth invites complacency. Kincaid funds 3 satellite wash stations over the next decade and never removes the restitution ledger from public shelf, even when figures cast him poorly. Reverend Crow keeps Ruth Pike's canteen on a bracket near the church entry with a card beneath it. Clean water is a covenant, not a convenience. In 1916, after Mercer's death at 72 during a late winter pneumonia season he spent instructing younger hands, the town sets a carved lintel above the infirmary gate. The words are plain and deep-cut, readable in low light and snow glare alike. Preparation is mercy made visible. Elkhorn grows beyond 312 souls, then beyond 500. But in hard summers and fast thaws, one instruction still passes from porch to porch without argument. Build it like Mercer before the fever names your house. The phrase traveled that autumn exactly as the old warnings had once traveled, by gatepost and wash line and porch rail, only now it carried instruction instead of ridicule. On October 18, 1916, with first frost silvering the north ditch and the morning thermometer at 27 degrees, Lena Pike stood at the upper pump with 2 apprentices from Timber Creek and made them run the test from the beginning. She poured 1 cup of carmine dye into the marked runoff trench above the old privy line, snapped her watch case closed, and sent Caleb Rusk downslope with a slate to record minute marks at the pump mouth. Jasper Noon held the crowd rope and kept children back from the stone skirt Amos Pike had rebuilt 28 years earlier to Mercer's measurements. When the first pale red thread touched the outflow at 8 hours and 52 minutes, Lena did not look surprised. She only had Caleb write it clearly, then made him read the number aloud so every household runner could carry the same figure home. "Build it like Mercer, before the fever names your house," said Alma Voss, now gray-haired and straight-backed, as she took the slate copy toward the boarding row. No one laughed. They repeated the line and went to work. That same afternoon, the restitution ledger came down from the public shelf in Kincaid's store for the winter audit, as required by the town code. Horace Kincaid had lost weight since the outbreak years and moved with a careful stiffness in his hands, but he still read columns faster than any clerk in Elkhorn. He sat at the long pine table with Elias Trent, turned pages to the quarantine months of 1888, and checked each overcharge entry against receipts that had been tied in bundles by street. Soap, vinegar, water casks, lamp oil, household by household as Mercer had ordered in the churchyard. May Kincaid, recovered and now co-proprietor by written deed, carried a locked cash tin and set it between them. When a claimant line formed at dusk, she paid each remainder without argument. 58 cents to the Bell estate account, administered by Thomas Bell's sister in Dry Fork, $1.12 to the Crow Parsonage Fund for supplies bought at panic price, 31 cents to Cora Latimer's laundry ledger, where an old credit had never been closed. Kincaid signed each receipt, then placed his own initials beside the clerk's. The store board posted the total under flour cost and coal rate. By the first week of November, they had settled the final open claim from quarantine year. Trent carried the closed ledger, wrapped in canvas, to the Infirmary archive room carved into the back gallery, where Mercer had once kept his 1881 field notes and the first intake book tied with waxed cord. Lena took the ledger with both hands, set it on the shelf beneath the outbreak maps, and entered one line in the index register: restitution complete by ordinance, verified November the 7th, 1916. She signed her full name and made the apprentices sign as witnesses, so no one could later call it rumor. 3 days later, with snow threatening but not yet falling, Reverend Crow came to the archive room carrying a narrow bundle wrapped in oilcloth. He had grown slower and softer in speech since the epidemic, and the pulpit certainty that once kept him from action had been replaced by plain accounting. "I withheld this because I believed sentiment weakened record," he told Lena. "I was wrong in that also." Inside the wrapping lay Mercer's cracked pocket watch, stopped at 4:17, the same watch he had used for smoke tests and boil timings from the first winter in the Bluff. Crow explained that Mercer had left it on the church table during his last pneumonia instruction round and had not returned for it before his final decline. Lena entered the watch in the inventory beside the intake slates, the sand glass, and Ruth Pike's canteen bracket card, then placed it under glass with a label that named function before memory, timing instrument used for airflow, boil, and contamination drills, 1887 to 1916. Thread by thread, Elkhorn learned to archive its errors as carefully as its victories. On November the 19th, after Sunday service, Amos Pike stood by the infirmary gate while Lena checked winter cordwood counts against the old requirement of 9 cords per month for continuous sterilization at full occupancy. He watched her tally for a long moment before speaking. "The first nail packet, and linen, in May of '88, he said. That was Lena. Her mother cut the cloth. We sent it without name because we feared what Kincaid would do to the Forge account. Lena did not deny it. She only turned a page in the supply register and wrote the donors' names where the old line had read anonymous. Then she drew a neat bracket from that entry to the travel kits now hanging by the door, each fitted with square nails, cloth rolls, soap, chalk, and a copy of lane rules. What had entered in secrecy had become standard issue. Not every silence opened so cleanly. Jasper Noon admitted at last, in front of the apprentices, that he had pinned the reservations open at Mercer's tomb sketch at the assay office in 1888 and had watched men laugh before shift. Caleb Rusk admitted he had once joined the Creek Path chant and then, during the fever, had hidden his face under a scarf while hauling waste past the same boys he had led. Two former committee members never came to speak at all, and Lena entered no confession on their behalf. In the training room, she told apprentices that some reckonings arrived in words and others never did, but protocol could not wait on remorse. By December 2nd, with noon temperature holding at 18 degrees and wind driving powder snow off the ridge, the Bluff Infirmary ran its first full winter drill without Mercer. 22 trainees from Elkhorn, Quartz Hill, and Cedar Bluff assembled at first bell. Cora Latimer led cloth segregation at the wash station and failed 3 teams for crossing clean and foul paths at the doorway. Ben Yarrow, nearly deaf but still exact, made haulers rerun cart routes until wheels left no slop stripe on lanestone. Lena took the map wall and assigned a simulated cluster from schoolhouse to bunk row, requiring each apprentice to calculate contact households, boiled demand, and cordwood depletion in 6-hour intervals. At midday, she opened Mercer's original ledger to the page where he had written, in the hard winter hand of 1888, "Continue by substitution." She read the line once, shut the book, and handed the class to May Kincaid for ration control exercises, using actual store inventories and price caps from ordnance. Expensive failures still existed in every frontier town, and they usually wore polished language. Elkhorn's answer remained modest and laboring: boiled water, separated lanes, measured pits, public books, shared instruction. When evening came, the trainees carried lanterns to the gate where the carved lintel had been set after Mercer's burial. Snow had begun in earnest by then, a fine hard sweep from the northwest, and each flake caught in the groove of the deep-cut letters before melting in the lantern heat. Preparation is mercy made visible. Lena touched the lower edge of the carving once, then stepped back and called the final roll by name, including the dead who had paid for the pages they now studied: Edwin Hale, Ruth Pike, Thomas Bell. The apprentices answered present after each one, not as theater but as obligation. Then she dismissed them in pairs with travel kits, route maps, and sealed copies of the Elkhorn Code, sending some north toward camps that still trusted luck more than ledgers. The gallery lamps burned low behind her, air moving steady through the 11-inch shafts exactly as Mercer had taught and measured. Above the creek, in a town that had once mistaken confidence for preparedness, children carried 2 rules home before sleep: white hand for clean draw, black hand for foul discard. And if the thaw came fast or the summer turned rank, they knew what to say and what to build before fear could choose for them.